He was America's guy, the Fresh Prince. The movie star who could make you laugh and cry, who had built a career on charm, wit, and an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences. Will Smith seemed to have it all figured out. And then, in one moment at the Oscars, in front of billions of people watching around the world, everything changed. One slap, one moment of rage, one action that would expose decades of pain hidden beneath the perfect smile. This is the story of how a superstar's carefully constructed facade cracked on live television. This is Will Smith's reckoning. For over 3 decades, Will Smith built an empire on one thing: likability. From his days as a rapper in DJ Jazzy Jeff's group to his breakthrough on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to his dominance in Hollywood blockbusters, Will cultivated a persona that was impossible not to love. He was charismatic, he was funny, he was relatable. He was the guy you wanted to hang out with. But here's what we've learned. The person you see on screen is rarely the whole story. Behind every carefully crafted public image is a human being with struggles, insecurities, and pain. Will Smith's image was so polished, so perfect, that it was easy to forget that he was human, that he was dealing with things, that he had demons like everyone else. Throughout his career, Will gave us hints. In interviews, he'd talk about pressure, about the expectations, about the weight of always having to be on, but nobody really paid attention. We were too busy enjoying the entertainment, too caught up in his success to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. Will Smith's personal life hadn't been without controversy. His marriage to Jada Pinkett Smith had faced public scrutiny over the years. They dealt with infidelity allegations. They dealt with relationship struggles, but they seemed to weather it all, presenting a united front to the world. They were a power couple. They were supposed to have it figured out, but behind closed doors, things were more complicated. Jada had been open about her struggles, including discussions about unconventional aspects of their relationship. Will had spoken about the pressures of maintaining his image while dealing with personal turmoil. The perfect marriage, like so many perfect images, wasn't quite what it seemed. And then came the Oscars. One of the biggest nights in entertainment, millions of people watching. Will was there to present an award. Everything was supposed to go smoothly. Everything was supposed to be perfect. And then came the joke that changed everything. A comedian on stage made a joke about Jada's shaved head, comparing her to an action movie character. It was meant to be a light roast, the kind that happens at award shows all the time. But it wasn't light to Will Smith. And it wasn't light to Jada either. Here's what's important to understand. That joke didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of something much deeper. Jada had been dealing with alopecia, a condition causing hair loss. It was something deeply personal to her, something she'd been vulnerable about. And here it was, being mocked on the world's biggest stage. In that moment, something inside Will broke, or perhaps more accurately, something that had been breaking for a very long time finally shattered. He walked on stage and slapped the comedian. The room fell silent. The world watched in real time as the mask came off. That slap wasn't really about a joke. It was about decades of pressure. It was about a man who had spent 30 years maintaining a perfect image suddenly reaching his breaking point. It was about a husband defending his wife, but it was also about pain, frustration, and the weight of expectations finally becoming too much to bear. What fascinated people wasn't the slap itself, it was what it revealed. For years, Will Smith had been carefully managing his public persona, but that one moment exposed what was underneath: raw emotion, real anger, real hurt. A superstar who wasn't as polished as we thought. A human being who was struggling. In the days and weeks following the slap, Will issued apologies. He talked about his actions. He eventually stepped away from projects and took time to reflect. But what was more important than any statement was what that moment taught us. That nobody is as together as they appear. That even the biggest stars are dealing with things we can't see. That pressure, when left unaddressed for long enough, eventually explodes. Will Smith's entire career had been built on maintaining a certain image. The funny guy, the charming guy, the guy who could diffuse any situation with humor and warmth. But that image, maintained for so long, had become a prison. It had become so important to protect that he couldn't be authentic. He couldn't show struggle. He couldn't show weakness. And that's the tragedy. Not that he slapped someone, but that the system that made him suppress his emotions for so long forced him into a situation where his only outlet was rage. The culture of celebrity that demanded perfection, that punished vulnerability, that required a constant smile. That culture created the conditions for his breakdown. Will had spent decades being strong for everyone else, being the public figure, being the inspiration, being the guy who always had the right thing to say, but nobody was checking in on him. Nobody was asking if he was okay. And that, more than anything else, is what the slap revealed. Here's what we need to understand about Will Smith's story. Maintaining a false image costs something. It costs your mental health. It costs your authenticity. It costs your peace. When you spend decades not being yourself, not expressing your real emotions, not dealing with your real pain, it builds up, it accumulates, and eventually it explodes. Will is far from the only person dealing with this, but his prominence made his explosion visible. It forced a conversation that many of us need to have. What are we willing to sacrifice to maintain our image? How much of ourselves are we willing to suppress? And at what point does that suppression become dangerous? The slap was a moment of loss of control, yes. But it was also a moment of truth. It was Will Smith, after 30 years of careful image management, finally showing us that he's human, that he struggles, that he has limits, that behind the charm and the wit and the perfect smile, there's pain. In the aftermath of the slap, Will faced serious consequences. He lost opportunities. He faced criticism. Awards bodies took action, but more importantly, he was forced to confront himself, to look at the choices he'd made, to examine the image he'd spent so long protecting. And that reckoning was necessary, not as punishment, but as growth. Because sometimes we need a moment to expose us. We need to be forced to look at ourselves honestly. We need to break through the facade so we can actually deal with what's underneath. Will has spoken since then about the importance of addressing issues head-on, about the dangers of suppression, about therapy and introspection. And that's the real story here. Not the slap itself, but what happened after. The willingness to look inward, the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to actually deal with the pain instead of just covering it up. Will Smith's story teaches us something critical. Your image is not your reality. Perfection is a prison. Authenticity is freedom. And the moment you start suppressing who you really are to maintain how you appear, you're setting yourself up for a breaking point. We all wear masks. We all have versions of ourselves that we present to the world. But when those masks become more important than our actual well-being, when the image becomes more important than the person, we're in dangerous territory. That's when pressure builds. That's when breaking points emerge. The slap didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of decades of suppression finally reaching its limit. And while it was shocking, it was also instructive. It taught us that even superstars are struggling. Even icons are human. And that maybe, just maybe, we all need to be more authentic, more vulnerable, and more honest about our pain. Will Smith's journey from the Fresh Prince to a man who slapped someone on live television is a story about the cost of perfection. It's about what happens when we prioritize image over authenticity. It's about the breaking point that comes when pressure is never released. But it's also about redemption. It's about a superstar who was forced to confront himself and is choosing to do the real work. That's the story that matters most, not the slap, but what comes after. The willingness to finally, after 30 years, be real.